Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Between Two Psychs, where Mike and I talk about all things psychology and education. This is the third episode in our series around neurodiversity. Our first one looked at how to support neurodiversity in the classroom. Our second episode looked at how to support school leaders in supporting neurodiversity. And today we're looking at how parents can support neurodiversity. And Mike, you have had some quite interesting experience in this field, haven't you? You've run quite an interesting parent program. This might be a good launching point for us. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Thanks, Adam. So when I was a senior ed psych, I worked closely worked closely in a multidisciplinary panel. And one of the things that we identified as an area of need was the support that parents required in parenting. As an EPS, an ed psych service, we set up a program that ran 90-minute sessions twice a month, morning and evening, um, hosted by an educational psychologist and attended by parents of children with autism or children who were on the pathway and awaiting assessment. And the content of each of those um, sessions was in many ways dictated by parents, and the education psychologist would then be a contributor with the psychology, but there was no expert model. Everybody in that meeting was an expert. Parents with their expertise of being parents, and the ed side with the expertise of psychology.
So, what the parents just had problems that came up during the week, and they would turn that into a question and bring it to the ed psych?
Pretty much, or ongoing difficulties being a parent of a child. They might be things like one of the topics was screen time. So how do I stop my child being on the screen for as long as they are?
Hmm. Oh, screen time's a nightmare.
Yeah.
I've got a young boy who's just about to turn 2, and he already knows how to turn on the TV, and he's constantly asking for Mr. Tumble. But honestly, when you have them around screens, their attention span just goes all over the place.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see it play out in real time. Sorry, go on there.
Well, maybe we should do a podcast just for you, Adam. Uh, and we,
So for me and raising my son,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, that was the sort of thing. And then sometimes education psychologists would actually take a chunk of the time and do the equivalent of a bit of a training input. Um,
Yeah, it makes sense.
and I think today we could touch on some of those sort of inputs that um, w- I covered and the team covered from the EdPsych service.
Yeah. And I suppose this is a good point to let the listeners know that we are focusing on what parents can do for their children who are neurodiverse. It's not to say that the entire responsibility lies within their hands, because we've already covered two other episodes on this. And it takes a village to raise a child, regardless of their whether they're neurodiverse or not. And I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind throughout this entire episode. These are things that you have control over in your own home to do, rather than you're the only person that can solve the problems that your child is facing.
Absolutely, Adam, and we should also cast that net wider to all parents, because what we say is autism practice is good practice. So whatever we're talking about today can be used with children right across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so suppose we should start with the basics. What would we consider a basic thing?
Um, One of the things that I would start with is understanding why routine is so important. And again, this could apply to all children, but for children with autism, what we're trying to support parents with here is to give that child a sense of peace, a sense of calm. And how do we get the child to that point? And we referred to it in the classroom of, but we're just going to kind of go back to it here. and it is routine and predictability. Um, how do we put routine into place in a home? One of the things that I've seen used successfully time and time and time again are the equivalent of visual timetables.
Mm-hmm.
Come across those, Adam?
Yeah. It's my first go-to when I write recommendations. It's on my predictive text.
Uh, have you seen any good examples of visual timetables? Or
Yeah, it's one of those ones that is underutilized. When I've done a few home visits, the best ones I find they're usually in the kitchen, because that's where people spend most of their time. Or if it's not where they spend most of their times, it's the most transient part of the house. People move through it quite often. And you would have usually Velcro or quite colorful communication. Some kids need black and white because of the high contrast. It helps them support processing. However, now your next board, so we're doing this now, and next we're doing that, and the kid goes up and takes it off the Velcro. Or you have the entire day, and usually they come down in big strips down the wall, starting with, depending on the level of need and understanding, it can be down to get up, put on your slippers, put on your pants, put on your trousers, go brush your teeth, make your way downstairs. Some kids need that level broken down. Others, it can be much more segmented, whereby it's get up, get your breakfast, brush your teeth, and they can go through in that way. What about you, Mike? What have you come across?
pretty similar, really. It's good that you highlighted the immediate differences there because no two children are going to respond in the same way. So we have to be thinking about taking something like a visual timetable and making it personal to the child understanding it. Um, so the best ones I've seen are, as you say, but also indicate the day ahead for the child. So challenging times are usually weekend or school holidays. So what's coming up in the day today, and like you say, it could be breakfast, or it could be a trip to the pool. Then after that comes a return trip home. Then after that is going to be a trip to grandparents' house. After that is home. So each activity is clearly laid out, so the child understands exactly what's coming today.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to really hone in on. Stick to the plan. Why does sticking to the plan work for many children?
Are you asking me, or are you going to answer that one?
I'm asking you because I'm going to write it down.
So we go back to what impact this has on a child. So children with autism, they can struggle to regulate themselves and to keep themselves at what we call a level of inner peace, a level of um, calmness. And these sort of strategies uh, go a long way to supporting a child understanding what's coming. And because they understand what's coming, they're feeling very content in themselves. Because they're feeling content in themselves, their behaviors are more in line with what parents want the child to be behaving like at home. So we're thinking about big pictures such as challenges that can go on in the home and bringing it back to a process like this and understanding the impact that predictability has on your child.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the behaviors that come with that and the importance of predictability. I look at it in a very similar way. When you have a good plan and the child understands that plan, that predictability reduces the cognitive load on them. And when most children who are neurodiverse, if you imagine we talk about cups being filled or empty, and what we're really saying is how close they are to becoming dysregulated. When you have a plan that makes sense and you can predict the next part of it, you're not adding more water into that cup. What you're doing is you're putting a hole at the bottom of the cup so it can drain out a bit, and that child can have more cognitive resource to get on with their day because they know, okay, in 10 minutes time I'm going to move on to this, so I can dedicate more of my energy to what I'm doing rather than the anticipation of what is next because I don't know what's coming next. And that's how I kind of view that the value of visual resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and it's a good analogy, the hole in the bottom, because if you've got a a situation where a child is feeling very anxious or uncertain, there's an awful lot of emotional regulation that's required of them to try and deal with that. And that in turn can lead to outbursts of behavior or a distance in themselves or other forms of challenge that parents have often raised in conversations.
Hmm. Absolutely. Is there anything else in terms of the basics outside of routine and predictability that we should explore for parents?
I think making sure that we've got forewarnings, being explicit about expectations. So,
Go on, they sound good. Got my pen out again. I'm going to write these down.
so forewarnings. I mean, obviously, this thing that we're talking about is a visual timetable process forewarns the child what is coming in the day. But I'm talking here about change that can happen.
Here we go. This is where it can get tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if we've got a change happening, so the car doesn't start, so therefore we can't go to the pool. How are we going to deal with that? Another forewarning might be that, the afternoon scheduling visit to grandparents has to be cancelled because they're not very well. So being able to forewarn children that change is coming is a very important thing that we should also consider.
Yeah. And do you think there should be any sort of strategy in place ahead of time to do that? I'm thinking about some families I've worked with where they have like almost like a code word that they've trained the child. If you hear this code word, it's something's changed and we haven't done this to you. It's because it's outside of our control. Like uh-oh moments or something like that. Have you had any experience about supporting parents around that?
Yeah, it is a difficult one because when we're dealing with forewarnings, the majority of the time we know that something's come up. So like we gave the example about the grandparents basically ringing up saying we're not very well. So you've got a few hours notice. And what methods of communication can we use to support the child to deal with the fact that they are no longer going to do something that they are looking forward to? Well, you've got a 2-year-old. How do you do it?
With my 2-year-old, there's lots of cuddles. Lots and lots of cuddles. No, that's not right for every child, is it? Many children with neurodiversity or autism, physical touch is hard for them. They can't manage that. And I think this is where it's important to understand the psychodevelopmental side of what it means to be neurodiverse. So if you think about child development, they spend a huge chunk of their early life developing their senses, how they assimilate the environmental information, how they integrate that into their being, who they are, and how they make sense of that information. Some people would narrow it down to something as simple as processing, and for people who are neurodiverse, that can be very different. Some people can't can filter out noise. And what I'm building up to is you've got to understand how your child regulates. What is the best way for them to regulate? And for some kids, that is going down the sensory route.
Yeah.
There might be a particular activity they like. Some children I've worked with in the past, they like to spin. So if you've got some bad news to tell them on the spot, it's like, we might want to do a bit of spinning first, and then I've got to tell you something. That's quite an extreme one. For others, it might be, if I deliver this message verbally, I know that this is going to be a trigger point for them. because when I deliver things verbally, it takes longer for it to process. It means that they have more time to build up the anxiety in their mind. If I use a visual communication tool, for example, some families will have a social story in the house and they'll pull that out and they'll use that social story to communicate that change in plan and straight into the methods and how we cope with that. So, say for example, like going back to your one about grandparents are sick, what do we do when we have a change in plan? We think of a new plan. The new plan can be just as fun. So if say you're going to grandparents' house for dinner and you can't now, maybe we'll go somewhere else for Sunday roast. It could, and it's about making sure that that child has another social script, another template to work off that allows them to process those difficulties, and that comes with time and dedication.
It does. And I'm glad you brought social stories up because I did want to come on to that, and I'm going to come back to it in a minute. But I want to come back to the thing that you described there with dealing with the situations that arise, and even you weren't expecting them to arise. Like we talk about the car not starting. Um, and your question to me was, well, how do we communicate that to children? And you mentioned with your own that you do lots of cuddles. And then you added that that might not work for everybody. And I think that's the important thing to just pick up on for a second, because one size doesn't fit all here. We're talking about children that can have various reactions to a situation. Um, for you, your child responds well to cuddles, but a next child, that might be the last thing that they're going to respond to. But you said something really important there, and we see it in schools a lot, and it's something called co-regulation. The adult knows the child, and they're able to regulate the child's feelings and thoughts with them, rather than expecting the child to regulate the thoughts and feelings themselves. And my point here, Adam, is it is very much what does your child need you to do in order to help them to co-regulate? There isn't a magic answer to that one. That is the question that
No.
every parent has to think about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And like you said, it's about knowing your child. Understanding where they're at developmentally is a huge part in this game around co-regulation. Like I gave that example around using sensory needs.
Yeah.
And usually that would probably be reserved for a child who hasn't quite developed what we call emotional literacy skills. And the simplest way to think about emotional literacy skills is, do I have the language that I use associated with different types of emotion, sadness, happiness, joy, and that can often be taken for granted amongst most of the population because we usually acquire it quite young in our lives. If you're neurodiverse, that journey can be much trickier because the introspection around your sensory development isn't clear cut. So when you say things like sadness, that can be tricky for some children, say, for example, with autism. They know the word, they might have some sort of cognitive understanding of what it's supposed to mean, but they can't make sense of it for themselves. And that's where you have to sort of try and figure out where is their emotional literacy skill at and what can I do to support that. Um, we in schools we often use ELSA support, emotional literacy support assistants, and it's almost taking some of those principles and using them at home, going back to those visual. We talked about visual timetables to begin with. There's no reason why you couldn't use visuals to communicate emotions, how do you understand emotions. So, um, a child is getting upset, and you would show a visual saying, "Are you excited or angry?" And like the parent knows which one they are, but it expects the child to reach for it. And it's just given those associations over time that they start to go, hang on a second, every time I see these two visuals, it's always the angry one I go for. So there's something about this. And then the parent goes, yes, there is. when you're in this situation, you tend to feel angry. What can we do about that moving forward? And you slowly start to build up that independent regulation that we often take for granted in human development. But really, co regulation is going back to what you said at the very beginning. What was it? Autism practice is good practice. Really, this principles apply here too. If the more we can do these types of practices for all children, the greater their independent regulation skills are going to be, the greater the chances for them to take on those unexpected uh-oh moments.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, so in answer to your question, in dealing with those moments, it is a case of being a parent myself, and you're a parent. You do your best in the situation, and obviously that's not always going to be the get the result that you wanted. But we're thinking about then helping the child with ND, so that might then lead into something like, okay, I know my child um, responds well when they're upset to being on the swing. So we'll go out and we'll go on the swing, and I'll just support my child to co-regulate. Or I know my child responds well when they're lining things up. It relaxes them and they enjoy it. So we're going to do that together. And you know, you very quickly are able to support the child to get back into a state of calm. But it is about knowing what the child responds well to.
You touched on something there. It was quite interesting to hear about it doesn't always go the way you want it to. Uh,
Mm.
and I mean, this episode's about neurodiversity, but there is an element of parenting, and no matter how much you know about parenting, you are going to mess up. And there's an element of resilience that goes with that. It's like you have to accept that you messed up, so to speak, and pick yourself up and get back on the horse. And any parent that says they haven't messed up probably isn't a parent, because there's no way you can do this job and not mess up. So there's an element of forgiveness there, isn't there?
Certainly to yourself as well. But coming back to forewarnings, and something I did want to come back to, which is the social stories, and you mentioned it. Um, because social stories, they forewarn children about what's coming and what to expect. And in some circumstances, what to do in that circumstance or situation. So, when we're starting off and talking about how to keep a child in a state of happiness and calm, social stories can address that predictability or that uncertainness that causes children with MD some quite challenging issues.
Is it fair to say that social stories has a positive impact on a child's internal working model? And I suppose for the listener, it's helpful to explain what internal working models are.
Oh, there's a few. I mean, have you got any in mind that you're thinking of?
I'm just talking more generally, that sort of idea that a social story is something you learn dealing how gives you strategies on how to deal with those tricky or unpredictable situations. But over time, our internal working model, as we learn new things and experience new things, it's always adapting and changing. So it might your internal working model be very different from the Mike of 20 years ago. And I find, I want your opinion on it more than anything. Do you feel that social stories are an effective strategy for helping neurodiverse children having a better appreciation of their internal working model and how they can adapt?
I absolutely do. Yeah.
Hmm.
So I'll give an example of what I'm thinking with a social story. So this happens in most families. You think about, we're going to go out for a meal. You think to yourself, the last time we went for a meal, my child really struggled to the point that we didn't have the meal in the end. It was easier to leave the restaurant and get home. So a social story there would, and it has to be real, the story does really for it to have impact. So the social story needs a little bit of preparation. But what it could involve, to take the analogy of a restaurant, is as a parent, you take a picture of the outside of the restaurant and then you take a picture of the inside of the restaurant. because that's real. And so the child knows, okay, I know what the building looks like from outside. I know what the building looks like from the inside. And the story kind of doesn't have to address every minutiae, but it addresses the main things that you want the child to understand. So when we go to the restaurant, we have to stand and wait to be seated at a table. When we're at the table, we're given a menu. When somebody comes along, they're going to ask you what you want to eat. So I'm telling the child what to expect. The other side of the story is what I want them to do when they're in there, because this is the benefit of a social story. You're teaching people how to behave in certain situations. So when we're in the restaurant, we can't run around and, throw soft toys around like you can at home. This is how we behave when we go to a restaurant. So you be very clear to support the child to understand it, and that predictability takes away the uncertainty. And when you take away the uncertainty, you take away the anxiety or the worry or the other sort of emotional upset that can come, which cause problems.
Yeah, and sticking with that predictability element, it seems to be the theme within this episode. I want to touch a bit on consistency because this is the other element of it. We talked a lot about visual communication and and forewarning, as you said,
Yeah.
but over a long period of time, a big chunk of parenting for neurodiverse children is just being consistent with your routine, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, oh, sorry.
Well, the example I was going to give is, I've been a parent. I'm still in the early days. My son's just about to turn 2, and we had a big problem with sleep. And it turned out the best way to get him to fall asleep at a regular bedtime was the consistency of routine in the lead up to going to sleep. So things like bath time, and even the order in which we put clothes as pajamas on them. Uh, I think must have sung the same song for about 6 months just to soothe them. And we invested in a grow clock. I don't know if you're familiar with the grow clock, Mike. Are you? Might have been
Not
with
sure.
well,
I'm much older.
a grow clock is simply a clock that changes color depending on the time. So for my son, we changed the color to red when it turned 6:45, and when the clock changed red, it let him know that okay, it's getting to bedtime. And obviously, for the first few nights, it doesn't have any sort of impact; it's meaningless. But I'm reinforcing that with language. I'm saying, "Look, the clock's turned red. It means that it's time to go to bed soon." Now it's at the point where it turns red. He's pointing to his bed and telling me to go put him in there. And the point I'm building up to is that took the exact same actions day in, day out, for quite a few weeks.
Yeah.
And eventually he gets it. And it's the same with children who are neurodiverse. The more consistent you can be in your routines, and you said at the beginning, the weekends and school holidays are the hardest because that's the hardest time to be consistent because you don't have that inbuilt routine of school life.
Yeah.
And that's something that the parents have got to keep in mind is when you know you're entering a period of low consistency, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to lean on, I'm going to develop a social story about we are entering into the weekend. This is less predictable than during the week. So you've got to find ways to accept that. So we'll try and tell you 2 or 3 days ahead of time what we're trying to do. But also on the summer holidays, you have a much bigger break from school. So what are we going to do about that? How do we make that predictable for them? Are we going to lean on more social stories, or are we going to use verbal communication just to get that across? What do you think, Mike?
It's what works, isn't it? Really, and it is basically that what works. You've got two or three strategies. What works best for you is always my line on this. But the key thing that we're trying to get in this podcast is there's a few things to try, see how they go for you. A lot of parents will say to me, "Oh, I've tried visual timetables and it didn't work." It turned out they tried it for a few days or maybe even a couple of weeks. Um, but the consistency wasn't there. And that's what I think is a secret success word, is consistency.
Yeah, and if you go back and listen to our episode on working in the classrooms, we talked about similar things of like being consistent
Yeah.
with your students. It just makes you that predictable adult, and if you are that predictable adult, children trust you more, regardless of their whether they're neurodiverse or not.
And not just children. I mean, we as adults, without realizing it, we're creatures of habit. We have our routines. And when those routines are broken, it does cause a reaction. Most of us are able to deal with that because we're adults and we've got the skills required to deal with those changes. But for young children with ND, they haven't quite got that self regulation and ability to cope yet. So it is about us giving parents a couple of ideas, a couple of strategies that are evidence based. These work.
Yeah. You did say something there about, adults have the skills over time to deal with changes in routine. And I think that's very true. I think children can often present as more capable than they are. A big chunk of that, I think, is when their language skills come in and you can start reasoning a bit with
Yeah.
them. You feel like they're emotionally more mature than they are, and quite often they're further behind. And that's not anything that they've done wrong. It's just a part of the natural way we develop.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think, although I don't necessarily want to go into detail on this because it's probably another podcast on its own. We're dealing a lot at the moment with children who refuse to attend school, and there's a lot of uncertainty to do with schools, particularly when a child goes to secondary school, and dealing with the change, dealing with changes in people as they change, because teenagers are constantly looking at developing identity. So what they are one week might not be what they are next week, and so on. And most young people can deal with that, and for somebody with ND, that's difficult. So trying to help people understand the complexities of life will come down to evidence-based strategies that we're referring to here, predictability, and how to cope with change and other circumstances that arise. And that's social stories. They're very, very adaptable to helping parents to work with young people to understand why their world is a bit different.
Yeah. You almost opened up a can of worms there
Yeah.
talking about identity. That's a whole mini series in its own. But you're absolutely right. For children and teenagers in particular, identity becomes a big issue for them. And if you are neurodiverse, that is harder to manage. Because you've got to manage the social world as well as your internal world,
Yeah.
and certainly the social world doesn't come easy to you.
No, no. But I think that point, Adam, it's worth going back to something you said earlier, which is partnership and partnership with schools. Because schools are great places for supporting young people through interventions with things like social skills or emotional management. They're very, very good places with good intervention strategies to support with that. So it's worth maybe saying to parents, if you've got a young child that's a bit older, like the sort of late primary, early secondary, who's challenging, to have a chat with the schools, keep talking, stay open with the school.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We know early intervention works best. So the quicker you pick up on something and put something in place, the better chances that child is going to respond to it. And you also said about keeping those communication channels open. That's worth its weight in gold just by having a good relationship with the school, because you can get those interventions in place and you know that they're going to be consistent whenever you trust the school. Again, go back to predictability of adults. If the school environment's predictable, you trust that they're going to do their job.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
Hmm.
talking about team, it goes back to something we said in the first podcast, which is no one's alone. So even though you're parenting at home, we don't want them to feel alone because they've got connections that they can have with school or similar. And schools in turn, if they get to the point where they're thinking, well, this intervention is where they reach out to external staff such as ourselves. So there's always a team going on around the child at the very center.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point to put a pin in it and stop there. We've covered a lot in such a dense episode. Like any other episode, if you have any questions for us, please reach out to us at either one of our websites. We're always keen to work with new people, new schools. Mike, anything you do want to add?
No, absolutely, Adam. It is as you say, but if we just do a quick recap and then we can sort of bring it to a close. But we've talked about why what appears to be simple strategies are effective. So visual timetables, they look very simple, but they have such an impact. We talked about things like social stories. They look very simple, but they have such an impact. And then we were just touching on, teams around the child. So yeah, we have covered a lot.
Yeah, predictability and consistency, I feel like, has been the theme of this episode. So if you take away nothing else from this, please take that with you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. Good talking to you.
Thank you, Mike. See you soon.
See you soon.